Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone here, and I'm so thankful to be here today and to share this space. I really like doing these kinds of lectures live because there's so much to experience and learn, and I welcome questions. For folks who are joining us later, please feel free to use the email listed, info@boundlessbellydance.com, to connect if you have any questions or additions or comments. I always love to hear. So my name's Keisha. I've been in this community as a Raqs Sharqi performer or belly dancer for I think 17 years, which is a long time. I started when I was just little. And in 2019, I got this beautiful opportunity to go and train a little bit in Egypt, which was absolutely life-changing and phenomenal. And I'm really excited today. Some of the slideshow images that I have actually are photos that I took when I was in Egypt, which I always find really special. So I'm by no way an expert. We're always learning and evolving as we go in this art form, just like with anything. And this is what I've learned over my journey and how my teachers have taught me, and what I've gathered from research. But this slideshow changes every year with new information. So it's good to stay relevant and do your own work and look things up on your own if you're curious. But this is kind of a synopsis of Raqs Sharqi history or belly dance history. So we've got videos today and images and all sorts of good stuff. And I do this slideshow and lesson at the beginning of all of my belly dance sessions in class. So the goal is to have folks kind of really informed before they start their dance journey. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and get started here. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and start with how we understand Raqs Sharqi. So here's some images you see. I'm in there as well. A little bit of a timeline of belly dance. So here are some misconceptions that I hear about quite often. The proper term for this dance is belly dance. Raqs Sharqi is for men or for the male gaze or seduction. So that's not true, and we'll get into that as we go forward. Raqs Sharqi is a gendered dance, so you hear a lot that this is a dance for women, by women, and I suppose there's some truth in that, but we'll talk about why that is a bit of a misconception as we go forward. Another one I hear a lot is that you have to have a certain body type to participate in Raqs Sharqi, and like I hear this on every kind of end of the spectrum. So you have to have a big belly or a small belly, or big hips or no hips. You have to be a certain height. You have to have a certain torso size. And that's all not true either. You can have any kind of body and be a successful Raqs Sharqi performer or dancer. The next one that I hear a lot is Raqs Sharqi is an ancient art form, which is kind of interesting because I guess elements of it are quite old, and some are really new. So that's always an interesting one to explore as well. So if these are misconceptions that you've had about this art form in the past or that you still carry with you, kind of take note of that and use this as a good opportunity to learn. So we're going to get started right away with the terminology or the name. So what we use now is considered dance. The actual term for this dance is what's called Raqs Sharqi. Raqs is to dance and Sharqi is of the East. You'll also hear the term Oriental dance or danse du ventre, and then of course belly dance. What's interesting about this is the term belly dance was actually created and coined by a French man who was traveling in Egypt and saw people performing an art form he hadn't seen before. And this dance was utilizing torso muscles, and so he coined the term belly dance because he felt like what he was seeing was the dance of the belly. The interesting thing about that is, to me, is kind of like, that could have been a really great learning opportunity for him to stop and talk to the performers and kind of learn the terminology. So that's kind of a good starting point of how we can see already at the beginning of our understanding in the West, how colonialism and that like desire to place terminology, familiar terminology, impacts this dance form that was already kind of established and created. So right from the beginning of our understanding of this dance form, we have some colonial impact. Of course, belly dance now is used globally, and it's okay to use, I think, but we want to be really mindful that the kind of proper term is Raqs Sharqi. So where did Sharqi start, or how did this become to be? So there's a lot of different theory. And one of the interesting things about this art form is it's not a written dance. So there's some art forms that have great written history. And so it's really easy to find a trail of where it started and how it evolved. With Raqs Sharqi and the dances that create Raqs Sharqi, it's more of an oral story. We don't have a lot of writings on it. So when we're learning about it, it's kind of, we're coming from a bit of a different perspective. But we do know that there was a group of dancers called the Gwazi dancers in the 1700s, and they performed an art form, more of kind of like a folk art form, but it's what we would kind of consider now as belly dance. And you can see in their costuming here that they were actually very covered in their dress, in their wear. And it's probably more, there's more to their outfit than what they would wear on a daily basis, but it's less showy. But they were coming from a place of performance, which is super neat, and always with live musicians, which is also super neat. And it said that these folks were kind of a nomadic group of people who traveled and performed. And there's some history that points to them coming from the Punjab region and then traveling through Egypt. And this group of dancers and their community were kind of considered the first performing belly dancers, which is kind of neat. But it's different than how we understand dance now. So there's a dancer named Kriya Mazen, and she is considered the last Gwazi dancer because she's the last person who carries a bloodline relationship to this group of dancers and the culture around it. And this is one of the pictures I got to take when I was in Egypt, which is super neat. And you can see she's got her musicians and she's dancing, and she's also wearing a dress, right? So it's still a bit of a different costuming. So I found a video of her on YouTube, and I just want to take note of, we won't watch the whole thing, but just of her posture and the way her feet are, and how she dances compared to how we might understand what we consider as belly dance now. So I'll just move through this here so we can get started. Good, so I'll just stop there. I could watch her dance forever. Oops, can I get out of here? How do I get out of this? Fantastic, yeah, oops. I'm just trying to figure out how I can get out of this full screen. That should take me out. Oh, maybe I hit this. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So yeah, so that's a video of her dancing live. And you can see it's significantly different than how we understand Raqs Sharqi or belly dance now. And what I really enjoyed specifically about her is she does this, we had a workshop with her, and she does this, she kind of teaches you through osmosis. So she teaches you less about words and body structure and more about copy follow. So you follow her feet. You could see were really intricate the way she was moving her feet. You could see they were really flat the way she danced. And there was lots, she was holding the rhythm with her body differently. And so instead of using like a vocabulary with words to show that or to teach that, she just took you into her space and shared it with dance, which I thought was really interesting. So it's kind of a profound thought to think about. She's considered the last true Gwazi dancer and kind of what that means. But we're so fortunate to have her still teaching in our area. Well, she's in Egypt, but still teaching for tours and stuff like that. Oops. Okay. So there's another group called the Alma dancers and the Egyptian dancers. And they did performing as well, but they were a little bit, they embraced more of an elegant platform, and they also were specialists in language and poetry and music. So there was a bit of a more rounded approach with them. Now the Gwazi troupe as well did all of those things, but a little bit differently. And what's interesting about the Alma dancers is they were sometimes associated with prostitution or adultery, which, if we look at historically, many of these dancers, like throughout the world in Europe as well, have a history of prostitution and adultery. It's been a currency in dance for a long time. So they are also a really important kind of fundamental part of how we understand Egyptian dance today. So moving on, I've got some strong vocabulary in here, so just be mindful of that. So I've been dancing for a really long time, and I've heard like probably almost every narrative you can imagine for people's preconceived ideas of dance. And I've heard this concept of like a goddess dance where we're worshiping a goddess or kind of inhabiting a goddess. And I've also had really intense words thrown at me in that kind of like sex and slut shaming way. So I've been called all sorts of things, including a whore or slut or whatever, because of my dance practice. And it's like kind of an interesting thing to think about. It makes sense that people have these preconceived ideas because we're watching performers move their body differently than maybe what we're used to. It's different than a balletic form or a jazz form. But it's also kind of interesting to think that even at a young age, people would be bold enough to say those things, and kind of where is that coming from? So the interesting thing is it's kind of belly dance or Raqs Sharqi is neither, and kind of, but there's also a crossroad with the goddess and the whore culture as well. And a kind of a big thing that belly dancers are associated with is strippers. I'm like, I don't really know why. I'm thinking because there's some torso and cleavage that's shown. I don't know for sure. But that's something that's, I mean, even in the last couple of years has been said to me. And we have this kind of inclination as performers to do a 360 and say, oh, we aren't strippers, we don't do that. Okay, that's true, it's true. But as performers and dancers, we're also not these like, you know, really feminine goddess worshippers either. So where is that middle road? First, I just want to say that I believe that stripping and sex work behind dance is awesome. I think that there's a space for that. So when we're kind of talking about this, and as we learn information, we want to be really mindful about how we react when Raqs Sharqi performers or belly dancers are compared to strippers or sex workers. The other thing we want to be mindful about is that there is a history of sex work in almost every dance form. And to kind of have a strong negative reaction around the assumption kind of discounts the experience of folks who got us to where we are today had. So people who choose to or chose to participate in stripping or sex work or whatever to help fund their dance practice. We don't want to put a negative, and we don't want to undermine what they did for us to get to where we are. And this is to be said with all sorts of different types of dance forms as well, including Western and European dance forms. So we want to be really mindful of that. Like, no, we aren't sex workers inherently, we aren't strippers, but there's nothing wrong with that platform either. And there is a history of adultery or sex work in all dance forms. What there's some theories about, I'm not totally sure where the goddess ceremony myth theory came from. What I do know is that when I was in Egypt, there's all sorts of tombs and there's imagery. And I think maybe there's imagery of dancers who are doing what might look like a goddess type dance. And I think maybe because it kind of is similar to what we understand as belly dance now in terms of imagery, and maybe there's like some imagery that linked goddess worshiping to that, it kind of created this myth that belly dancers are like historical goddess worshippers. It's not true. That's a myth. And the other thing is there's like this really intense comparison to femininity. So there's kind of a big pressure to be really feminine in the belly dance, how people perceive the belly dance community. And the truth is, both masculine and feminine energies have space in this art form and have actively participated in this art form since it's existed in both kind of a folk way and as well as a performing way with Raqs Sharqi. So yes, I believe there's lots of femininity within this art form, if that's how you choose to perform it, but there's also lots of masculine sides to it as well. So it's not inherently a dance for women, it's not inherently a dance by women, but the majority of people who perform it now are women. So there is some crossover there, but it's not kind of definitive that it's a feminine dance. And then this little fun fact, because it's oral history with Raqs Sharqi, we have all these kind of neat stories and stuff. And this one is that because this has always been a controversial type of dance, in Egypt at some point in its history, it was banned to perform. Women were banned from performing it live. But it was such a desirable dance to have. People wanted it. It's exciting, it's beautiful, it's fun. So men stepped in and started performing this dance form and doing it publicly and wearing costumes and having so much fun with it. And then, of course, that was a big controversy at some point. So then it kind of switched. So there's been all of this give and take with men and women and non-binary folks in the belly dance world and in our history. But I like to use that in all kind of that story is a way to show that men have and masculine energies have been really prominent in our history and currently. Oops. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to talk about the migration sort of and what it means in different areas of the world. So SWANA is an acronym we have, and it means Southwest Asian and North African. And we say this to describe the dance. This is also known as the Minat dance, Middle Eastern, North African, and Turkish and Greek dance. Both are okay. We're just kind of leaning towards Southwest Asian rather than Middle Eastern for terminology. So Raqs Sharqi is essentially created of folkloric dance and a theater type production like ballet. And the two of them were put together to create what we understand as Raqs Sharqi or belly dance. So before that fusion, we had, and currently we have, a number of folk dances that contribute to Raqs Sharqi. These are some of the ones I'm familiar with to some degree, but there's a million in the Swana community. But each folk dance has its own set of kind of vocabulary in terms of movement, has its own set of costuming and music. So we'll go through some here. These are three, like I say, that I'm familiar with. So Higala is shown here, and they wear kind of like bigger costumes, and the movement structure is really big. So their hip work's really big. Everything they do is larger than what we would see for Raqs Sharqi. And kind of this is an interesting thing to think about in terms of like how your body movement kind of correlates with your costuming. So because they're wearing big costumes instead of smaller, tighter costumes, their movements have to be larger, right? As a Higala performer, you would have to have big hip movement to compensate. Otherwise, you wouldn't see anything move. And so there's a certain type of rhythm on percussion and like a culture around the Higala dance. And I've done some workshops, but I'm not proficient in Higala, but it's really fun. The next one's Saidi, and you can see that here. Saidi has a really strong presentation of both feminine and masculine energy. And the way the dance is kind of constructed is there's both feminine and masculine parts and roles that you can play. Saidi is a rhythm as well. It's in a 4/4, so it's really kind of nice to listen to and to dance to. And if there's props, they use cane, you can see here. And it's just a really beautiful, if you have the opportunity to see a Saidi, I recommend it because it's really fun, really beautiful. And it's very stoic. So the posturing's very like tall and strong. And there's lots of kind of like footwork. There is hip work, but there's lots of kind of footwork and leg work with it. It's really cool, really neat. And Saidi and Raqs Sharqi are not, and same with Higala, they're not really like, you wouldn't really see them presented in a traditional Raqs Sharqi piece, but there's lots of crossover and influence. So most Raqs Sharqi performers and dancers know how to do a Saidi piece. And now we have elements of Saidi in kind of our modern Raqs Sharqi productions. So then the next dance, which is my favorite, is the Beledi. So Beledi's here, and you can see the Beledi and Saidi dress are similar. Beledi means my country, and it's a culture and a community. And there's like, so it could mean food, it could mean a language set. Beledi is not a language, but there's a dialect. It could mean dance. It could mean music. And Beledi, if we were in Egypt, for example, we would call it Raqs Beledi. So like the Beledi dance. In the West, people know Beledi is a dance, and so you don't have to say it. But just for context, it is kind of like a whole culture. And the Beledi music has like a sequence that it follows, and it tells a story of a Beledi dancer, which I won't get into too much because that's a whole thing in itself. But I love Beledi, and it's almost always improvised. Traditionally, it's an improvised dance and typically a solo dance. And the movement set is a little bit more limited, so you have to be like really creative and it's a really whole rounded, because you don't have a lot of vocabulary to pull from. And it's really based in your lower hemisphere. So with Saidi, for example, everything's so lifted and stoic and strong. And with a Beledi, everything's kind of dropped into your sacral, kind of like into your core. And it's really like grounded and juicy and flat. It's often flat-footed. And like, it's just, there's something to it that I just love. I can't get enough of. Now, with all of the Higala, Saidi, and Beledi, we'll see choreographies and group pieces being done just to kind of adapt to the way, the demand for a performance set. But typically, Beledi would be done as an improv and as a solo. And for reference, Saidi is Upper Egypt dance, which is actually like the south of Egypt. And Beledi, I think, is more central. The Beledi people were kind of like farmers, and they, if they did migrate to the city, they kind of stayed in a community set, which is super cool, and part of how we have this like oral story. Okay, so some pioneers in Raqs Sharqi. So Badia this is this lady here, she's Lebanese, and she was just this powerhouse, amazing woman and incredibly talented. And she opened up a club in Egypt, and she trained some of the top Raqs Sharqi performers that like in the world that we even know of now to this day. And it was this really cool dynamic where the performers would like learn as they went. So you would start really fresh, really new, and you would learn the steps and the dance and the music all day and then perform in the evening, and you just kind of grew with it and got better and better. And she kind of, her and then Mahmoud Reda, they were kind of the pioneers who put this art form onto a stage and kind of took the folk aspect of it and incorporated the ballet part of it. So this didn't happen until the early to mid 1900s. So this is quite new, really. This concept of how we understand Raqs Sharqi as this theater production or a performance art with this balletic art form is incredibly new. So this is where we start to see how, yes, the roots of Raqs Sharqi with Beledi, for example, are older, but the way we understand and perceive Raqs Sharqi now, very, very new, very new. And so Mahmoud Reda had, and I think the Reda troupe may still be around. He just passed away in his 80s, like I think in either last year or the year before. But he was a pioneer and created a troupe and put all of these dances onto a main stage. So in Cairo, Cairo had always been kind of this crossroads of culture. And so knowing that and kind of seeing this desire and seeing the population that was coming into Egypt at the time, he thought, okay, how can we take our dances and fuse it with something that's going to kind of appease this Western gaze and throw it onto stage? So there's some colonialism there for sure, but Mahmoud Reda was always known for this like passion for experimenting with other art forms as well. So he took these folkloric art forms, put them into a choreography, put them onto a stage, which was unheard of at the time, and fused it with ballet and jazz and swing, and kind of created what we now know as Raqs Sharqi, is this big theater production. So between the two of them, it kind of changed the way we understand dance, and had this massive ripple effect, which is really neat. So now that we're into the 1900s, we can talk about Raqs Sharqi and Shabby. So Raqs Sharqi, like I said before, is the combination of Beledi and ballet together. You'll see kind of like a more balletic position and stance. And you'll see that when I was talking about Beledi, how the energy center is lower and really like grounded and hippie. You'll see with Raqs Sharqi that the posture and the energy centers lifted up. So it comes up into your core more. Yeah, so that's kind of a difference. It's with posturing, with an energy center, and also the fact that it's fused with ballet. So that was being developed, as we say, in the early 1900s, and we'll talk about the golden era of that soon. And then in the 70s, in and around there, an art form called Shabby was created, which you can see her here. She's super cute. And she's also wearing typically the dresses. They're dresses, but they're short. So they're not the full length like what you saw with Beledi and Saidi. And it's kind of like, it's a modern, it feels more folky, less balletic. And they use kind of like a shabby dancer will use a more modern song, like a pop song, what we would consider a pop song. So it's like a little bit more of what you would see if you were to go to a club, or if you're the music you would hear, excuse me, you would hear if you're like taking a cab or in a restaurant. So it's like more of a modern music set, but with a folky type dance. It's very interesting, super fun, very cheeky, very cheeky. And you can see with Raqs Sharqi, and as probably what you understand and have seen here, the costuming is typically 2 pieces. Raqs Sharqi, depending on the type of dance you're doing, can have a fuller skirt or a tighter skirt. There's often slits in the legs. So it's like different and like lots of cleavage. So it's very showy. It's always quite glittery, really elegant. It's a little bit different than shabby or beledi or saidi. So, excuse me, outside of Egypt, we have dance in Turkey and Lebanon and Greek. There's Greek dance. And there's also types of Raqs Sharqi or belly dance kind of throughout Southwest Asia as well as North Africa. So it's not just remote to these areas and regions, but this is what I'm familiar with. So you can see the costumes are kind of similar. The costumes are kind of similar here, but still different. There's like differences and nuances in them. And part of this is about the era they're trying to capture, and part of it's about region. But essentially what happens is each region has taken their own sort of folk dance and applied it to the way we understand Raqs Sharqi now. So there's differences and the vocabulary is different, which is very, very interesting to think about. So I'm not super familiar with Lebanese style dance, but I know that it's very internal and very balletic. And Turkish dance is really, Turkish Raqs Sharqi belly dance is very like flirtatious and exciting and sassy, and I love it as well. And Greek dance is, it's really upbeat, and well, there's slowness to it, but it's like really fun. And you can see more of a folk dance element to it, and the vocabulary is a little bit more limited. So to someone who's not super familiar, you might not be able to tell the difference, but I kind of challenge you to look at, if you're watching Raqs Sharqi moving forward, start thinking about kind of what style of Raqs Sharqi is this, and can you hear a difference in the music, and can you see a difference in the way they perform the movements? The primary difference in all of these dances is the music. And with Raqs Sharqi or a folk dance, your goal is to sort of show what the music would look like if you could see it. So you're showing with your body how you hear the music. So that in itself, if you have music coming from different regions, you can see how the dance would be heavily impacted by that, because the music's going to be so different. So that's kind of a fun thing. I like to tell my students as they progress through the program and as performers to start really paying attention to what they hear and what they see a dancer do, start seeing the differences. So let's talk about Raqs Sharqi in North America and how we got here. Okay, I've got another video here, and now I understand how to get out of it. So in 1893 to like 1895, we're not totally sure the exact date, there was a big Chicago World Fair in Chicago. And these world fairs they were massive, and they had whole blocks dedicated to different cultures and different countries and stuff. And one of the organizers thought, hey, let's bring a performer from Egypt and create a street that was like a Cairo street and have like music and culture and stuff. Now, I will say these world fairs were incredibly problematic. There was lots of racism, lots of not great stuff happening. But it also kind of showed the West different cultures, and it employed folks from said cultures often to come and show the West these different art forms and foods and musics, which is fantastic. So this would be the first time that the West has seen how we understand belly dance to be ever. They'd never seen it before as a whole. And so it was really shocking. It was like very interesting and intriguing, but shocking, because these people were dancing differently, and they were using their torsos and their hips and their feet and their legs and their chests, and they're doing shimmies. It was very different than what we had understood as to be dance up until that point. And you can also see these are the two, there's three dancers that went under the stage name as Little Egypt. These are two of them. And you can see that they're fully clothed. I mean, she's wearing, I don't know if you can tell, but this is a white top under that comes up to her neck. She's fully clothed. Like, they're not even form fitted, they're, looser clothes with full coverage, but it was still kind of controversial. Now, this isn't the right music, but this is a clip from that time. So from there, it kind of repeats itself. But you can see, if you've seen a Raqs Sharqi performer or a belly dancer in the past, you can see how different it is. Yeah, amazing they had film. I know, it's incredible. And like, yeah, both moving film and pictures, amazing. So what's kind of neat is you can see how different it is, right? Like, she's really more akin to what we saw with the Gwazi dancer, yeah, where she's like flat-footed and she's got some spins that aren't so like lifted and balletic, and they're like a little bit more, there's more movement to the spin, and it's like really grounded, and she's got like big accentuate chest movements, and she's got big pelvis movements, like very different than how we understand Raqs Sharqi now, but also really similar. You can see the links. But that was so controversial and loved, absolutely loved. So kind of this polarizing, people were having a hard time understanding it, which makes sense, right? So from there, let's move in. Now let's talk about the golden era and what that looks like in different places. So that World Fair, people, when they saw that, thought, how can we have this in our life all the time? This is amazing. I love it. Music's different, dance is different, everything's great. And so it kind of became this like really intense craze in the early 1900s. And kind of in the 20s and 30s, you can see this link between the burlesque, the golden era and vintage burlesque, and belly dance. And you can see, if you watch like a golden era burlesque show, you can see so many of the movements are derivative of this Little Egypt dance. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because to me, that really makes sense. It kind of follows along a history of this interaction between some sexuality and sensuality and dance, and just kind of like how burlesque is a dance that also utilizes your chest and your hips and your legs, and belly dance is that as well. And you can see how those start to overlap. But it's a controversial thought as well, because, like, as much as Raqs Sharqi has its history, it also isn't really ever been considered a sexual dance or sexualized dance. So it's kind of an interesting thing to see how that worked and played out. In the 20s and through to the 70s and 80s, I would say, Raqs Sharqi, huge hit. So suddenly, like, restaurant owners are trying to get dancers in there. People, it's like on TV, people are watching it. There's like, a huge movie industry in Egypt surrounding dancers, like big stuff. Very exciting time, really good time to be a dancer. In that, in the West, there was a form created called American Cabaret. An American Cabaret, like, it can be a little problematic. It was kind of a mash pot of all the different dance art forms. Like, so there was elements of Turkish dance and Egyptian dance and Greek dance and Lebanese dance, and all of these different dances kind of thrown together into one and called American Cabaret. And the benefit to this was we had tons of props. We had like the zills and zigette, and we had veils and all of this stuff. So it was really entertaining, and you could do like 90-minute sets and people were enthralled. And this is kind of what we saw a lot of in the 70s. And with that, you'll also see like, this is a good example of how belly dancers started showing up in Hollywood. So now we're seeing it come outside of the East and more into the West in our movie scene. And there's pros and cons of that we'll talk about soon. So here are some vintage Raqs Sharqi performers during the golden era. Both these ladies are Egyptian, and they were performing in Egyptian movies. So this is Samia, super famous. Love it. I almost forgot to fast forward there because I get so caught up in her dance. But we can see a really fundamental difference from what we saw with the Little Egypt performers than what we see with her. And over the 60 years, it really evolved and changed. And that's largely in part because of the balletic influence that we saw and we talked about earlier. So you can see she's got a more lifted demeanor. She's much more like, oh, you know, soft and prancy almost, and like very elegant. And it's like less of a rooted dance and more of a lifted dance in that case. And so you can kind of start to see the evolution of what we understand Raqs Sharqi to be today. And you can also see that there's lots of interaction between the musicians and other dancers. And so she's like, it's kind of this really beautiful community feeling that you get from it. This is another woman. She's also a movie star, really influential.
اللي بيجرالي يا ليل يا ابو الليالي احكي له على اللي بيجرالي اللي شغلني وبات خالي يا ليل يا ابو الليالي يا ليل يا ابو الليالي يا ابو الليالي يا ليل يا ابو فضلت عايش بيه.
So you can see she's following a similar format in her posturing and stuff, but it's different. It's still really different. And part of what I love about this art form is that every dancer, specifically the folks who really made it, have this really amazing ability to bring uniqueness into their dance form. So those, you know, they're doing the same dance, but it feels really different. And that's about the song and the music, but also just about their essence and kind of like who they are as performers. So I I'm reading Bethany. You're so funny. I'm reading your comments. So yeah, so you can kind of see like the evolution here. Oh my goodness. Of how we started, you know, in this one place and we've ended up where we are. I love seeing that history evolve in such a short, condensed amount of time. Next. Okay, so let's talk about the costumes and really get into it. So how did we get from point A with the completely clothed, like, you know, bigger costume sets from point A to point B, where we're, you know, in the second video, you saw how like her skirt was transparent and she's wearing like a tiny top and she looks so gorgeous and it's so flowy, but it's very like, it's a bit more revealing. So how did we get from here to here, right? Like really, in such a short amount of time, how did that happen? Well, unfortunately, just like some of the rest of our history, there was some Orientalism and some racism. And what happened was there's this prominent dancer in Europe who was putting on this beautiful production. She did like ballet type stuff. And she wanted to do an Arabian Nights thing, which is going to take us into this next part of the Hollywoodism. And I'll try and be quick because I'm coming up to my time. I get too excited. Anyway, so she put on this theatrical production and tried to have a belly dancer, an Arabic dancer. And she just kind of dressed them in this like really Arabian fantasy, like pretty racist costume, and actually had them in full brown face. So she painted their skin brown. Really problematic, really awful, super racist. And that was the first time that we saw a more revealing costume set for this type of dance. But the prominent Raqs Sharqi performers at that time thought, instead of, you know, taking it as instead of shutting it down, let's reclaim it and let's actually make it work for what we're doing. And so they kind of reclaimed the costume set and made it better and made it more appropriate and more relevant to the dance set and created a costuming that suits the dance, kind of like when we were talking about Hegala and Saidi and Belady, costuming that suits the dance, but let's incorporate some of these more theatrical aspects, these flowier aspects, some a bit more revealing aspects. But it's like interesting because that's such a prominent part of this dance now. And it actually came from kind of a really not great place. And just kind of the power behind this kind of reclaiming it and making it into something bigger and better and more beautiful. I find that so interesting. And it's good to know as performers. So let's talk about the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural exchange. So how can folks like myself, who's outside of the dance, outside of the Middle Eastern community or culture, how can I perform Raqs Sharqi ethically? And same with like other dance forms and musics and stuff. So fundamentally, the difference is, and we can't get into it too much, but the primary difference is between the concept of exchanging and consensual exchange, and a power dynamic where one more powerful group steals from and profits from another group. So when we talk about cultural appropriation, we have lots of different theories around it. And another good way to understand it is the culture of origin, or the source, like a source dancer, for example. So the person is from that place, they grew up in that culture, and they're a performer and a profiter. These are the people who get to decide whether the culture is an open culture or a closed culture. And for closed cultures, which we see kind of in different areas in the West, we see different cultures are considered closed. Those are ones that foreigners outside of the culture can't perform in, can't engage in unless given specific permission, certainly can't profit from. And open cultures are ones like blues music, jazz, Raqs Sharqi, hip hop. They're considered an open culture, so other people can participate in it as long as it's done respectfully and in an ethical way. So a really good story I like to tell is that during the World Fair, as we talked about, the concept of moving your body in that way was really different. But there was this kind of kinship between hula dancers and Raqs Sharqi performers, because they both had kind of like a hip-driven movement, leg and hip-driven movement. And so they became kind of good pals. And today we can see a movement exchange. And there's shimmies that are derivative of hula dance because these communities got together and exchanged and have this wonderful share of culture. And it impacted the way we understand dance now, which is so neat. And so an example like that is a really beautiful example of cultural exchange. And also just realizing where we stand in our privilege and having a really good, deep understanding of the elements and the cultures around these art forms, and not just doing it just to do it, but to understand deeply what it means culturally and kind of on a social political level. So that's a little synopsis of cultural appropriation, not the wholeness of it. Okay, so let's get into this. So there was a big era of like kind of hypersexuality in the belly dance community. And this is where we kind of like circle back and talk about Hollywood. So we saw a really cool display of Raqs Sharqi performers in like a movie setting, and how awesome that was, and how you could see really how like authentic that was. But on the flip side of that, we had in the West, Hollywood kind of got into the Raqs Sharqi craze and was hiring folks who were really aesthetically beautiful, but maybe didn't have a lot of training, and throwing them in really tiny costumes and putting them like in James Bond movies, these other types of movies. And while there were some really talented and professional dancers in the Hollywood industry, there were an equal amount or more of folks who were just kind of profiteering off of it and creating this like really hypersexualized idea of what Raqs Sharqi is. And so it kind of changed the way we understood the art form and the dance, and in not a super great way. The benefit to that for teachers and instructors, when you start putting it in media, very popular. So it's really easy to be a performer or a teacher at that time. I even saw it when Shakira did the Super Bowl. The next class series I had, full, because people saw it on TV and they want to try it. So I love it. But there's a way to do it professionally and respectfully and ethically, and that was missed a lot in this kind of Hollywood era of dance. So then also what started happening was folks were like, hey, I saw that, I can do that. And so they started just buying the costumes and just dancing, and they were just getting hired to dance in restaurants and stuff. And we see that a little bit now, but not as much. And so that kind of degrades the quality of the performance. This beautiful, articulate, genuine art form becomes a showpiece, right? So there was all this kind of like really intense hypersexuality, and it was being done in a way that really wasn't ethical. And so what happened was a community of people saw that and thought, okay, we need to stop that, stop it. Let's take the sex right out of Raqs Sharqi or belly dance. But the problem is you can't really do that. Like, we understand that you can't actually do that because of the history and how the movement was created. So you can't actually do Raqs Sharqi if you're going to completely take sexuality or sensuality out of it. So then we have to create a new type of dance, but put it under the belly dance umbrella. And I don't have time to talk about the medieval fair situation, but if you're interested, just shoot me a message, I'll let you know. So this is where fusion starts. And I used to be a fusion dancer. I was really involved in the community, and I still do some fusion. So what happened was folks were like, oh, stop the hypersexuality, hard stop, and did a 360 on it. And so this like era of fusion started. But of course, what's happening now is you've got folks who are outside of the culture gatekeeping what the culture means and what the dance means. Not great. And with that, because we were kind of in a situation where there was a lack of information and knowledge available, we kind of entered into more of an appropriation side of things rather than an exchange or an appreciation. So you can see this is kind of like coming from a fusion perspective. There's three main dancers here who are really fundamental in the fusion timeline, which we won't really get into today. But it started with Jamila, and then Masha had her studio, and then Carolina, who now has like one of the biggest fusion studios in the world. But you can see their costuming isn't really It's very different than what we understand as Raqs Sharqi, and it's very, very different than what we understand as like a folk costume. So it's kind of like a made up thing for aesthetics. And some of it's great, but some of it you can see like just this like some of the face paints and marks and the bangles and bindis and stuff. This is where we start mashing cultures together, and it's not awesome. So there's some really heavy problematic things with the fusion world because we kind of got too excited with this idea of sharing culture and we forgot to check in. But there's some greatness to it because it kind of created a safe place for people of all body shapes and kind of backgrounds to come and dance. It put it on a different platform, so you're accessing a different group of people, and it kind of refocused the narrative away from this hypersexuality. Even if maybe it went a little too far, there were some great benefits in that as well. So from there, from that fusion set, we go into what's, I think maybe they don't call it tribal fusion anymore because the term tribal is problematic. I think maybe it's called transnational dance. I'm not entirely sure what the terminology is now, but you can still see like there's some, even if the movement set isn't super problematic, we can kind of see there's some problematic things happening in the costuming still that are, I think they're trying to address it now. But it's kind of good to know as a community, just the differences and the strengths and negatives to the fusion world. So in Egypt, I need to know about the fairs. If we have time, I'll circle back. So oops, oh my goodness. So in Egypt, it's kind of tough to be a Raqs Sharqi performer, which sucks because that's where it's from. And there's like a whole bunch of theories around this. In the 80s, booming. Like the way Raqs Sharqi is performed in Egypt is like full orchestras, dancers, and then there's singers, and it's like a whole production. You have like 2 or 3 people who are opening for you that are doing singing and stuff. You have backup dancers. It's a production every show. It's amazing. And that was booming in the 80s. And then kind of in the 90s, but specifically into the 2000 or into the 2000s, there was this really big like crash of Raqs Sharqi, and it became really tough for local performers and source dancers to get work. And there's lots of theories like the government changed and the laws changed, but also there was this really big influx of foreign dancers, so folks outside of Egypt, specifically like in Europe and the States, coming into Egypt to perform. And like the truth is, well, okay, this is an opinion, but in my opinion, the truth is somebody like me, while I feel I'm a proficient dancer, can't hold the same standard as a source dancer, somebody who's been born and has lived in this culture their entire life and is now choosing to perform it. There's just inherently, there's a difference in the way that we dance. And so when you have an influx of foreign dancers coming in, they can't keep up with the local dancers, so they start bringing in like props and fire and stuff. And it just kind of like changed the way that people understood and saw and viewed Raqs Sharqi. And I think that personally, I believe that that was one of the main reasons for the kind of downfall of Raqs Sharqi. But that's a theory, and it's not backed up by anything but then what I've seen. So it could be other things as well. So right now, the dynamic is kind of like tough. It's really hard to be a Raqs Sharqi performer unless you're really famous, which is similar to here, I think, in a lot of things. Like you're not super celebrated as an artist until you're really, really famous and making the big bucks. So that's kind of where they're at. It's hard to be somebody who's just making a living. You have to be like a movie star and famous to be given the accolades that you deserve. We're not going to get into the misconceptions about women, which I would love to, but that's too long. But I will say that there are, the way we understand kind of our understanding of feminism here and what we project onto the East, there's some problematic areas there, and there's there's more of a resiliency and a strength and an empowerment in Egypt that I saw firsthand and that I've listened to and that I've been taught than what we understand here in the West. So it's important that when we're coming into an art form like this, that we're not trying to like come from a place of saviorship, or that we as non-Egyptian women are saving the dance or saving the women in Egypt. It's just not the truth. It's just different. But we won't get into it too much here. So the next thing we'll talk about is Dina. And then we're almost done. Dina, I took these pictures. She's considered the last Egyptian belly dancer. And she upholds the standard of that kind of like golden era belly dance that we saw in the 80s. You can see she's got like a full orchestra. She rolled in at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. or something. We were waiting for her all night. She came in, she did like 5 costume changes. Like it was just her and her band, and she's just phenomenal. She's just amazing. And we'll watch a quick video. And when we were there, she taught us a workshop, and she's like this lovely person. And we kind of were like, what does it mean if you're the last person you're considered the last Egyptian belly dancer? What does that mean for us as people trying to learn and like, you know, be in this culture? And she said, well, there's always one big star. So historically speaking, there's always one big star, and they're always considered the last. So she believes that once she retires, a new star will emerge, and we'll still have this quality entertainment and learning opportunities and that kind of thing. So I'm loving her optimism, but it's also a little bit intense that, you know, we have the last Gwazi dancer, last Egyptian belly dancer. It's kind of an intense moment in time to think about. So we're going to quickly just watch her dance. This is 2019. Look at her costume, so sassy. Okay, I'll stop it there. I could watch it forever. So even when you look at her compared to the folks like what we saw in the 50s and 60s, there's something really different. There's been an evolution there, but it's also because of this beautiful thing that we have where we can foster independence and individualism within the dance form. So I would say the experience of seeing her live is like, it's unlike anything else. But you could see the orchestra she had behind her. You could feel the joy and the excitement that was coming from an audience just being filmed. You could see all of these elements at hand, and you can kind of understand why she's considered the last Egyptian belly dancer. So if you're interested in learning more, just reach out. I'm sure you can tell I'm always really excited to talk about it. And there's a lot more to learn. So I encourage folks to do their own research and to keep learning in this art form. And I'm currently running classes right now, so you can find that on my website as well if you'd like to learn more. Before I leave, are there any questions I can answer? Do people feel pretty good? Okay, we'll end it there. So I'll just stop recording now. Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure. It's so exciting for me to be able to share this with our community and bring some light to this really popular art form. So thank you. I really appreciate that.